We're going to reconvene, everyone.
Now I'd like to ask Amari Watkins, go and take the podium and introduce yourself and begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Wu. Good evening, board members, Superintendent Aguilar, community. My name is Amari Watkins. I'm the district's accounting director. I've been with the district's business leadership team for 14 years, and I will be presenting the information to you this evening on our budget update. So a quick overview of what we'll be going through this evening. First, we're going to go over how we got here and to this existing situation, including a background and timeline over the last year. We're going to discuss what we are facing with respect to a state takeover, where we are with our current budget situation, how we spend our dollars as compared to other school districts, and what we look at with respect to outlier expenses, and what's next, and what our proposed plan entails. So how did we get here in this current situation? Well, presently, California is the 41st in the nation in public school funding. And prior to Proposition 13, California invested a lot more in its public schools. But with a decline in its tax base, there were less dollars available and more initiatives competing for limited funding. And so presently, we're one of the lowest funded states in the nation. This is impacting all of the California school districts. And so this is initiative close to our hearts, and I know that last week, I believe everybody was at the Capitol petitioning and lobbying the state legislature for increased funding for our students in California. Now, similar to other urban school districts, we face declining enrollment, and what that means is each year our enrolled students are less than the prior year. And because the state funds us on the greater of our current or prior year ADA, we get a little bit of a relief from that, but that's just enough to give us time to make a reduction in how we spend our dollars to meet the decline in our student enrollment.
Pardon me, Amari. May I remind you to explain the acronyms like
Yes,
ADA?
did I say ADA?
Thank you.
Average daily attendance. So as a school district, we're funded on the amount of time that our students attend schools, not just on the number of students that we have enrolled. Thank you. Now, we've also seen increases to our special education costs, and we are not funded adequately from a state and federal level to cover the cost of running our education program for our students with special needs, because we have an imperative to provide a free and appropriate public education to all students, including those with special needs. We just don't have enough resources, and we'll go into that a little bit further on in the presentation. We've also seen increases to our employee compensation packages. So as the district has received additional revenue from the state, we in turn have invested in our employees and provided them with increases in compensation and benefits. Back in 2013, the state's funding model changed for schools, and when we received increased money from the state as a school district, we also received increased costs with respect to our state pension funds. So the state decided to transfer from a state level to the school district level an additional share of cost to pay for retirement for our employees. And finally, we have a higher health benefit cost than most school districts. Here in our district, we offer pretty much 100% paid for a majority of our employees and their families for health benefits. We also offer a lifetime health benefits program for retirees who are eligible. So in going over the recent background and the timeline over the last year, back in June of 2018, so roughly a year ago, the board took action to adopt a budget that had an existing structural deficit. And what that means is that the district spends more than it receives. So we don't have enough coming in to cover what we've chosen to spend our programs on. So we made millions of dollars in proposed reductions. We sent that budget to the County Office of Education for approval, and they disapproved our budget. So following August of 2018, we reevaluated, proposed additional cuts, and again, we were rejected by the County Office of Education. So following this disapproval, what this allowed us to do was invite the Fiscal Crisis Management Assistance Team into the district to perform a fiscal health analysis. They are a reputable organization in the state, authored by the legislature to help school districts in distress. So when they came in and did their analysis and provided their report in December of 2018, they found that we spend more on labor costs than most other school districts. So in response to the fiscal distress and the condition we were in March of 2019, the board made the difficult decision to do a reduction in force and propose layoffs for our employees. And at that time, we were expecting to run out of cash in February of 2020. So at that point in time in March, we were expecting to run out of cash to pay our bills in February of 2020. You're welcome. Which is a segue into our next section on what we are facing with respect to a state takeover. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt. So your previous slide, is that the set of facts that everybody agrees with? Or is that, because right now I know there's a lot of, like you mentioned, there's a lot of distrust. So are these in doubt at all? Are these so everybody
These are
agrees with
factual
this?
statements.
And everyone agrees with these statements?
I would think, have you heard otherwise? Okay.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Nathaniel behind you.
Just so you know, we have people at home watching, so I want everyone to speak in the mic.
I just had I'm sorry, about the layoffs that were mentioned or staff reductions. Does that include the pink slips for the teachers, the almost 200 or 170 some odd?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Does it include any for Cerna Center?
Yes.
What percentage, do you know?
I don't know a percentage. I think we had some numbers last time, but I don't want to misrepresent the percentage for Cerna. We can find that out.
Ms. Hard-Young, if you write it down, we'll find that out.
Any other questions? Sorry. Oh, no, that's fine. We encourage, if you have a question, you can ask. No, please do. So what are we facing with a state takeover, and what does that mean? A state takeover will occur if the district is looking at running out of cash. So to that last statement, you asked for clarification. If the district is looking at running out of cash, we would need to approach the state legislature and ask for a loan. And that's what it means if we're going to engage in a takeover. And what happens when we request a loan from the state legislature is that they're going to issue a loan that requires repayment of principal and interest. When we're required to repay that principal and interest, they're also going to appoint a state administrator whose sole responsibility is ensuring that we're repaying the principal and interest on the loan. They will look to pay for mandatory programs first, but anything supplemental and programming that we desire to do for our students are likely not going to be the first priority of a state administrator. Also, we lose local control, which means that the superintendent and the board loses power, and they have no control over running the district. It's the sole responsibility of the state administrator. And this is upwards of a 10-year process at minimum that we see for the other districts that have entered into what is considered a takeover or receivership. Now, experts will agree that this is the worst possible scenario for our community, and one reason being that once you have an administrator making those hard choices, we don't have available resources to put back into the programs that will most benefit our students. So for example, for our school district, with our current vision of equity and access and social justice for all students, we wouldn't have the opportunity to fund those programs. Some schools in neighborhoods that may be more inclined to fundraise may have the option to fundraise additional revenues to promote those types of programs like band and music and arts and sports. However, for some schools in other neighborhoods that don't have that fundraising ability, those students would go without. So here's a case study. Oakland Unified in the Bay Area. They had, back in 2003, requested a state loan from the legislature. That time they requested $100 million, $100 million. They're currently in the process of still repaying that loan. That loan costs them $6 million a year. That's $6 million a year that they don't have for student programs, and they don't have it to reinvest in their employees either.
Amari?
Yes.
Now, what size of the district is Oakland compared to Sacramento?
Superintendent, correct me if I'm wrong. I think they're roughly comparable to our size.
Yes, Oakland Unified, I think, is about 38,000, I think, the last time I checked. They have, I think, fewer schools now because they have closed schools and have a higher percentage of charter schools than Sac City does.
Thank you.
Just to add another tidbit of fact, in 2003, when Oakland Unified went into receivership, they had approximately 50,000 students, and right now they're at about 38, maybe right under 40. So there is a significant decline in enrollment under receivership. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just for clarification, what's our
Just over 40,000, or about 43. You're welcome. So now I'm going to discuss our current budget situation. And before I get into too much detail, I'd like to just define some terms that we'll be using pretty frequently through the rest of the presentation. The first being our fiscal year. Our fiscal year is the district's operating year. It starts on July 1st of every year and ends on June 30th. So we're approaching our new fiscal year in about a month's time. We also have several state required reporting deadlines, the first being the adopted budget. At our next board meeting, we'll be doing a presentation on our next adopted budget for the upcoming fiscal year. That's required to be approved by July 1st. Then we have what's called a first interim report. And our first interim report is reporting on actual activity through October, and it gets presented to the board in December of every year. Then we have a second interim report that reports actual activity through January that gets presented in March of every year. And if you are in a fiscal distress like our district, we're required to do a third interim report that reports activity through April, and that gets presented in May of every year. And then upcoming this September, we'll be presenting to the board what we call our unaudited actuals, and that's the actual activity for the entire year. Yes.
You also may want to explain the difference between categorical and non-categorical funding, because sometimes while the budget may look like it's X+3 and the reality of general operation, it may be only X+1. And for people who aren't in government, that's kind of a strange concept.
Yes, thank you. I hope to maybe address that concept in the upcoming slides. If I don't, please remind me. Thank you. So in this first slide is our total general fund revenue, and to your point, this is everything that falls in the general fund, both what we consider restricted and unrestricted programs. So I'm going to go over that, and that should address the comment that you just made, so thank you. So in total, as of last, let's say 2 weeks ago this evening, we presented the third interim report to our Board of Education for approval. And at that time, we reported that we had $537 million in the current fiscal year, so in the 18-19 year, in general fund revenue for all of our general fund. Now that's made up of several different sources, the largest being close to $400 million and what we call our general unrestricted revenue and our local control funding formula. That's our main apportionment that comes from the state of California, and it's funded on a base dollar amount per student, plus additional money for class size reduction, for high school, and then what we refer to as supplemental and concentration funding. And that's funding that's specifically for certain populations of students, including those that are low income, those that are English learners, and those that are foster youth. Now, we are required as a school district to present a plan for how we spend our supplemental and concentration dollars, and that gets approved by the community input and the board. And that plan we have to stick to that and how it's going to address its intended benefit for our students. And so we expect those supplemental and concentration dollars for next fiscal year to be at roughly $76 million of our general fund budget. Then our 60 million, the 59.5, that represents federal revenue. Those are what we refer to as our title programs. Title I, which serves low-income students. Title II, which is professional development, and Title III supports English learners. That also includes local pass-through funding from other entities that send us federal dollars. These funds are restricted, they have rules and regulations, and we have to spend them for the purposes that they were given to us for. Then roughly 70 million is what we consider other state funding. Those are funds that come from the state that are for specified purposes and restricted in their use. Examples include lottery funding and after-school education service funding. And the last slice of the pie is roughly $10 million from local income. That includes interest that we earn from money on deposit at the bank, charter school fees for providing oversight to those schools, rental income from permits that are given at our facilities for facility use, and any interagency revenue. So, for example, the County Office of Education gives us funds for our regional occupational programs. So now I'd like to go over the cuts that we've made to date in the present fiscal year. These have been board approved. The first series, and I apologize, hopefully you can read them in front of you. It's pretty small on the slide. But this was everything that was taken as of our first interim. So by the December time period, either through board action or district decision that was placed into the budget. So the first being $5 million in a position control true-up. And what this was that there were board authorized positions in our budget that weren't actively being recruited and weren't filled. So we took the opportunity of achieving savings for the fact that those were not filled positions and saw a reduction in our budgeted expenses for the year. And we received $5 million savings from moving our debt service costs to our facilities funds. So back, I want to say it was 15 or 20 years ago, we issued certificate of participation debt. And what this debt was used for was modernizing and refurbishing facilities and our air conditioning units at our schools. We took that at a variable rate, high interest, and had refunded it into a fixed interest cost lease revenue bonds for a huge amount of savings to the district at the time. So we are appropriately moving that to facilities funds. The debt can be paid from those funds, but that restricts what's available to us to spend on our facilities. We had $3 million in savings for our other post-employment benefit contribution. And what our other post-employment, our other post-employment benefit contribution is our retiree health care costs. And so the district already in its budget has an allocation that covers what we consider our pay-as-you-go costs for retiree health care. So what it costs today to pay those premiums for our current retirees, plus an amount towards our future cost. For this reduction, this was an additional amount of $3 million that the board had dedicated to pay down our future liability. Our unfunded liability is currently $780 million. We have $77 million invested in a trust to pay for future retiree health care costs. $780 million, and that's unfunded. We do have $77 million invested to pay for future costs. And that amount that's invested is, I'd like to share that it isn't what's considered an irrevocable trust. It can only be used for those purposes, for retiree health care costs in the future. We had savings.
If I can just mention, those of you who are more interested in this topic, certainly we could answer questions related to this, but when I came in July of 17, Superintendent Dave Gordon sent a letter, and I believe he mentioned that it was the 21st or 22nd letter that he had sent to Sac City Unified, obviously predecessors, other superintendents, and other boards, indicating that he was very concerned that $780 million today continued to grow. In 2003, and you can find this on our website, there was a report that was issued that showed that at that time the unfunded liability for retiree health care costs was about $350 million. So it kind of gives you a sense of how quickly that unfunded liability is growing, because we continue to offer lifetime medical benefits to new teachers and other staff today. So obviously we have to prepare to fulfill that promise when those individuals retire. When he sent me that letter in August, September of 2017, the unfunded liability was smaller than $700 million, if I'm not mistaken. So this is a cost that continues to grow over time. And we are third in having the largest unfunded liability behind Los Angeles Unified School District and Fresno Unified School District. Los Angeles Unified's unfunded liability, I believe, is about $13 billion. They're a much larger organization. Fresno Unified's is close to $1 billion, I think $980 million or so. And Sac City, we are third in the state with about $780 million.
Thank you, Superintendent. And to provide some context for those numbers, when we share $13 billion, Los Angeles has over 700,000 students, and Fresno has roughly 60,000 students.
About 75,000 students.
Sorry, apologies. And I'm going to finish my thought. So with that number, we have a larger percentage share, and we are one of a few, if not the remaining 3 districts that probably offer lifetime medical benefits to its retirees. Most districts will offer an other post-employment benefit plan, as well as local governments, but usually those end at age 65 with Medicare.
And just to briefly add to that, there are over 1,000 school districts in the state,
Yes.
right?
This may seem like a silly question, but how can you continue to offer those benefits?
Well, I don't know if the simplified response is that it's a negotiable item that we have to negotiate with our bargaining units moving forward. But in offering them, that was a promise that we made to existing and previous employees. And so there's a certain level of maintenance, even for those that are existing, that we would need to consider and maintain.
Is there a minimum number of years that they have to serve before that becomes vested?
Yes, there's a pretty elaborate table for all of the different bargaining units and the years of service that are required in order to vest and receive lifetime medical benefits. If employees leave the district and they have a break in service, that clock has to start over. So there's not the opportunity to jump back and forth and still retain their benefits.
So they can't register service?
No, if they have a break in service from the district, they lose eligibility for lifetime medical.
So districts who used to have lifetime benefits but don't anymore, what were the transition plans for those? I mean, because you've made a promise to the current employees. How did they address that in districts that were able to?
I don't know that I can answer that right now, but we can certainly look into it.
I'll just say, I mean, certainly that would require a grandfathering element. So you would say, starting with this X year, that, and other organizations have, of course, required employees to increase the contribution for that benefit. Currently, some of our employees pay $20 a month for that benefit. And so organizations that have sort of tried to address this unfunded liability have done a number of things like increased contributions to retain that benefit. But it is a negotiable item. It's something that we continue to have in place, and so that's why it's an unfunded liability, because we know that we're going to have that money at some point for new employees once they retire.
Just a clarification. So when you say this unfunded liability for 780, it's not just the teachers, it's all employees, right? Because I know that there are just a lot of, I think, misunderstanding that said, well, you know what, you're only out to, we have many friends that are teachers, and they say, well, you know what, I just want to clarify, so it is administrator and support staff is everybody.
It's not
Not
all
exactly.
employees.
Not all employees.
Okay. And then second is, I'm a state employee, and I know that, so we're on the, some of us old timers, we're on the, what they call the 2% of 55, and which is a very rich pension, not compared to the old days of, anyway. But the new employee, Governor Brown signed a new PEPRA, I think, and then they came in and they basically said any new employee starting, I think they had several versions of it. I think there was a 2013 version and there's another one. They moved up to 2% of 60 and 2% of 62. So, the newer folks saying, well, man, I'm not on that 2% of 55, but again, the unfunded, the OPEB thing. So in exchange for our pay raises for the last contract, they said, well, you get a 4% raise or 5% raise, but you have to put in 1.2%. So everybody said, well, I don't know, it seems like it's, but again, same thing, we had the same problem. It's a math problem. So I just want to make sure that, I point that out.
And in response to that, our, as superintendent shared, one bargaining unit pays $20 per member per month, but there's a sliding percentage scale for other bargaining units and unrepresented that we all contribute towards that future liability.
Amari, can you explain which bargaining units we have in our district?
Yes, actually there's a slide that will go into that in greater detail. Do you want me to jump ahead now or? Yes, I will.
And that was my question. I just wanted to know, because I know teachers have lifetime benefits. I didn't know if all the other bargaining units also had lifetime benefits. So that's kind of around the same question.
Yes, majority do have opportunity to become eligible. As an example, unrepresented management, we cap at age 65, so we do have an opportunity for other post-employment benefits with 20 years of service, but it is not a lifetime benefit.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for the workshop. I think this is really, really empowering for the parents, so thank you, Superintendent and Board, for coming on, helping us, partnering up with us in trying to avoid this receivership. My question about the receivership is if it does happen, unfortunately, do the teacher contracts get thrown out and do they start all over? What happens with that then?
I've heard different stories, but my last understanding is that the contracts are still in place. You would have to wait for them to terminate, or is it sunshine? And then, but if as they stand, they wouldn't just get thrown out, no.
Yeah, that is correct. So you wait until they're up for renegotiation. In the case of Oakland, the administrator there was able to negotiate a 4% salary decrease with the Teachers Association soon after 2003. So these cuts do happen, they get renegotiated.
They still have an incentive to go to the table and talk. Thank you.
So if I may break in, I just wanted to, because there was a lot of interest in the OPEB discussion and retiree health benefits, I want to note that as chair of the Fiscal Transparency and Accountability Committee, this is something that we will be taking a deeper dive into, and because I see there's a lot of interest in sort of learning more and assessing the sustainability and whether we have the resources to continue those promises, and if so, how do we create or free up the resources by reducing costs in other areas. So that is something that we're most likely going to look at in an upcoming meeting in July. So I just wanted to put that out there for you. Our normal meeting time is the second Thursday of the month at 6 p.m. So you can check the board committee page on the district's website for the agendas and see what will be discussed on those dates. But it is a public meeting of a committee of board members that meet to discuss transparency and accountability issues around our spending.
So my question is, if we do get taken over, what role does the superintendent play after that, or the school board?
I believe they're all terminated, if I'm correct. The contracts are terminated, the board is dismissed.
That is, to clarify, the board becomes an advisory body. The superintendent is removed. There is a county, and under new rules, the county superintendent, Dave Gordon, would appoint an administrator. And that administrator has the flexibility of hiring the necessary staff he or she deems necessary to right the ship. And all of those expenses have to come out of the district budget. So it's not like we get a free ride with additional people coming in on board. They basically get paid out of the district budget. But we lose our ability to have our local voice. The community becomes advisory, but there's the one administrator who makes the decisions for the district.
So I know that there's a lot of discussion about, you know, the benefits and all that. So when are these contracts? When do they sunshine? So when can there be a full discussion on where that is? Where we go with that?
Our largest bargaining group are the teachers, and I believe at June 30th this year their contract terminates or ends. Not terminate.
And just to clarify, if we do go into receivership, the contract will expire. Well, whenever the next one expires. But can the receiver, because he or she can make unilateral decision without any more input, can they just like instead of doing what you all have been doing, which is like a more measured way of trying to reduce the number of layoff, they could just say, hey, you know what? Based on these numbers, based on these trajectories, we need to lay off X, and that is it. Is that correct?
Yes.
There are education code minimums in terms of class size and other things that there are certain minimum standards that would need to be preserved. But for anything that is not state mandated or dictated by other obligations like federal IDEA for special ed or things like that, there would be a lot of flexibility to reduce staffing.
I want to clarify because I know that the contract for the teachers unions is up for renegotiation June 30th because that's the termination of it. But my understanding is, just to clarify, is it doesn't go away. It continues to stay as is, but it needs to be renegotiated right away. But until it actually is renegotiated, the current conditions stand.
Status quo.
And then as far as like pink slipping or whatever, you still have to follow the timeline of like when you have to notify them and go through the same processes that they're the due process.
Yes, as Member Morosky mentioned, there's a lot that we're still required by education code and other code sections. So the state administrator will come in and do what's the minimum legally required. Any other questions? You're welcome. I believe we left off with the $1.5 million in supply and services that were reduced to our prior fiscal year level. This did not affect the school sites. This was taken at a central office level. There was a $1.4 million savings with our utilities budget reduction. At the board meeting 2 weeks ago, at third interim, we found that there's going to be some cost increases in the current year related to utilities for some rate increases we've seen. So we had to offset that subsequently. But at that point in time, we had had a $1.4 million savings. We had a $1 million savings in central office classified reductions. These were additional vacancies in central office that had not been filled, and the district administration made the hard decision to eliminate those positions. We have some one-time savings, the first being $1 million from a legal settlement against a vendor that we were pursuing to get some revenue back to the district, and we've postponed that at this time. We had $900,000 in savings from reducing our special education transportation budget. It's important to note that this was not a reduction in service level. We just found an opportunity for savings in the budget. There were some unfilled permanent positions, and we had been filling those with overtime, in addition to some other cost savings there. We had $900,000 in savings from our visual and performing arts initiative that the superintendent had proposed for elementary school level visual and performing arts programs. That had not been implemented yet, so that was an opportunity for savings without reducing service levels. There's an $800,000 in savings from our extended learning summer program that we'd offered the previous summer. There was carryover available from that budget that was not spent, and we had absorbed that savings. There was also $300,000 in savings from a student services budget. Following last meeting, I found out a little more clarity on that. There was a budget at the start of the fiscal year with our adopted budget of $300,000 for positive behavior intervention supports and other contracts out of our equity office. And so since those had not been initiated, we found an opportunity to take savings of that at this time. And then there were $100,000 in board office reductions.
Amari, can you explain what the board reduction office cuts were?
I believe it was in services and contracts and travel costs across the board, the supply items.
As well as discretionary amounts that are available to board members to support their school sites when there is a need to address a concern. It could be any number of things: painting, fixing something, providing additional supports, contracting somebody to come and help our students provide services. Those amounts were reduced for each board members as well.
So at the time that these cuts were made, or after these cuts were made, at that time, what was the projected deficit still?
I'm going to step through that next.
Okay.
So I'm going to hold, and if I don't answer that,
okay.
Thank you.
For the board office reductions that were to each district, do we know how much each one was reduced by?
Board member, is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Yes, so each board member would receive a $10,000 discretionary fund, and it was reduced by half, $5,000 per board member. Now, keep in mind that this, like the superintendent had just stated, that we can use these monies for projects around our school sites. A good example of that is the Rosemont gate that's out in front of Rosemont High School needed it needed a paint job, and I was able to purchase the paint with my discretionary funds, and then our district staff came out along with a bunch of our community volunteers came out to remove the paint and then repaint it. So that was one project that I was able to do of many around our district. Well, not so many anymore. And then included in that $5,000 is any travel that board members do. So us board members get one training per year and it's through the California School Board Association. And that money is used for travel to and from, and hotel costs, and our registration fees.
If I can just mention very quickly, because I do want to make very clear, some of these savings, if you will, so for example, the visual performing arts, $900,000, that was an initiative that never got off the ground. We had allocated $900,000 in the previous budget. When in my first year here, I was very disturbed that our elementary schools do not have a visual and performing arts program. Weekly music, weekly arts, and we're very dependent on wonderful nonprofits who come into our schools and artists in residence who are volunteers and they support us, but we didn't have anything across every school district. And so we had made a decision with the board's support to allocate $900,000 to ensure that every elementary school had a more robust visual and performing arts program. Once we learned that we were going to have these financial challenges, we made a decision not to launch that initiative. So we never actually used the money. So it wasn't a cut, but it certainly wasn't a program that we ever saw come to fruition. So the students never benefited from it. And so those are the kinds of decisions that we made as early as July of 2018, where we had to make these very tough decisions. So I know that there's a narrative that, somehow we have found all of these resources. In fact, they were decisions that we started making as early as July of last year, where we said we think that our students should have access to visual performing arts in elementary schools, but we're going to decide not to do anything around visual performing arts and instead use the $900,000 to start helping us close the deficit or address our financial challenges. And so that's what we intended. We wanted to make sure that everyone understood. These were all decisions that we started to make as early as July of 2018, once we started to understand the severity of the challenges that we were going to face eventually.
So you didn't actually have to spend the money. Did you have it allocated and set aside so that you had the money?
The money had been budgeted, and it
budgeted and money in the bank are two different things.
Well, in our case, yes, it was available for us to use for visual performing arts. We then said we're not going to use the $900,000 for that, and it went back into the general fund, into basically our funds available to do whatever. And in this case, we said we're not going to spend it on that initiative.
Okay.
So yes, the money was available to us.
Okay.
We weren't waiting for we weren't waiting for the money.
And to just follow up on that, in the current year, we expect to end with a positive ending balance. This challenge that we're in is going into the future years. And so as I'll address, there's a compounding effect of decisions we make now for savings that will help us in the future.
Do you foresee cutting visual and performing arts now in junior high and senior high school?
That's a great question. At this point, we are doing everything we can to not touch programs that directly impact our students. You will hear from our staff on June 6th at our board meeting our best thinking for how we continue to approach this deficit, this financial challenge. And we are doing everything we can so that it doesn't involve additional cuts to student programs. So I guess it's an invitation for you to attend our June 6th board meeting.
Thank you.
May I interject? Superintendent, this is related to our fiscal situation perhaps, but I think it would be good for us and for our community to have some kind of opportunity audit because I keep hearing that we offer fewer opportunities, like maybe compared to some other districts, but it's hard for me to wrap my head around. And so I just wanted to put that idea out there that it would be helpful to have, because I know a lot of other districts offer full day kindergarten, transitional kindergarten for all 4-year-olds. Maybe they offer visual and performing arts for all elementary, more robust athletics programs, band, music. So I think it would be good for us to have a greater ability to have some comparative data on what we actually offer versus other districts as we're making these tough decisions.
Superintendent, with the visual and performing arts, are we now strengthening our partnerships with the nonprofits to fulfill this elementary? Because my daughter, I take her out of private school, and I really believe in public school. And I'm gonna save the money for the private school, but I really want to invest in my city and in my school district. And I just hope that we can find some kind of middle ground.
Yeah, the answer is yes. We are currently in the process of developing a strategic plan around visual and performing arts and capitalizing on the wonderful nonprofit organizations that exist in Sacramento, Sacramento Arts Commission, the Clara site, and the County Office of Education, which just received a countywide grant to expand visual performing arts. So we are not going to give up on remaining committed to visual and performing arts. It's just going to feel for a little bit that we're more dependent on other organizations to come in and work with us. And I think that that is the best approach for now, because we have wonderful nonprofits that provide volunteer support through artists and residents who come into our schools and give our students those opportunities. And we're required to coordinate and work with them, but until we have resources available to launch our own initiative, we are in the process now of working with every single nonprofit that has as a goal to expose our students to the arts. They are working with us, and they all have been very generous and have made a commitment to help us through this challenge.
Superintendent, can I just add to that? I think it's important to note also that our work with our county and city leaders, and the superintendent and I have been sitting and doing meetings with the city of Rancho Cordova, and the city of Rancho Cordova has Measure H money, and I think it's now maybe 3 years in, and they have a process where our schools in the Far East area that reside in the city of Rancho Cordova apply for grants. And they have actually funded music programs at our elementary schools and bought instruments for our students. And in fact, just recently, we were able to work with the city of Rancho Cordova to fund a summer learning program at AM Wynn. And it'll be our only school at this point that will have summer learning, and it was fully funded by the city of Rancho Cordova. So my hope is that we can use this as an example, and we start using it for our county and city leaders in Sacramento as well.
I just have a question. You mentioned $300,000 reductions for student services, and one example of that was PBIS. Was that also a program or an initiative that didn't take off, or was that expansion?
This
What
was
is PBIS?
And if you can talk about what that is.
Yeah, I did spell it out at the onset, and I'll remind everyone it's a positive behavior and intervention support. It's a program that's rolled out to students to encourage positive behavior at the school sites. That's one example. That $300,000 was worked into the initial budget last year in July. It was anticipated that we would implement that program. We hadn't yet spent those funds, and we made the decision not to implement that program at the time in order to achieve that savings.
So does that mean that we don't have a program?
We have
currently
other programs, then school sites do other things with respect to that. This was one particular initiative as part of that $300,000 that the equity office wanted to roll out across the district. And so there are other initiatives, but this was to achieve more equity across all schools.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? I'll just go back to that slide. In reminder of all those different savings that we discussed, the total by December that we had identified was $21.1 million in savings for that current fiscal year budget. So moving forward, with respect to second and third interim, so this would have been in the February and March time periods, we identified additional savings through cuts that we had proposed to make. The first being through our one-stop staffing process. And in January of every year, site administrators come together with HR and district administration in the instructional side of the house to determine what the staffing needs are at each site. And they look at the programs that are offered. And this year, we reduced that back down to the minimum level per contract and required that sites do a needs assessment, anything above the required minimum per contract, to support their school sites. And through that process, the budgets were reduced in anticipation of projected enrollment needs for next year based on our student demographics and what we expect in student enrollment for the next fiscal year, which would be the one starting on July 1st. We also had reduced contribution to our Child Development Fund. The program that we offer through Child Development, which is our early learning pre-K, if you will, and after-school support and before-school support for student care outside of the school day. And that program costs more than the money that they receive to run the program in a separate fund other than the general fund. So the district general fund contributes and supplements that program. So that was another area of identified savings, plus additional positions that we took forward as referenced previously to the March timeline for the reduction in force. And all of those personnel reductions added to $7.8 million.
For the Child Development Fund, you mentioned the before and after school programs. Are you referring to the ACES program?
No, this is for, this is separate from the after school funding, the restricted funding that we get for those programs. This is the programming from our Child Development Department.
I can speak to one of the reductions that was made to our fee-based after-school programs. So there's 4 fee-based that are unsubsidized after-school programs, and the idea is that these are supposed to be self-supporting, and they weren't. They were requiring a contribution from a general fund. So the difficult decision was made to reassess the fee structure and everything, and bottom line is a lot of families, including mine, will be paying, I think for us, for having 2 kids, we'll be paying upwards of $200 a month more to support that program fully. So we have made reductions that are impacting our families.
So I had a question along those lines then with the youth development. So because some of the funding was self-sustaining, it just wasn't quite enough. And so district had to fund some from the general fund, and that's what was cut out. So is the program still functioning in a smaller scale so that they can function? They just have to do it within their own budget. They're not going to get any additional money from the district. Is that my understanding?
Yes, thank you for elaborating on that. So there still is a child development fund. There still is a child development program. There was a needs assessment based on how it could be self-sustaining, and a partnership with our outside funding agency to continue to provide services. It's just not provided through the district directly. Any other questions? So again, this was $7.8 million in the spring, still in the same fiscal year of identified reductions, for a total of $28.9 million in either cuts or savings that we've adopted during the current year. These were adopted at the board's approval, and they did not require any negotiations with our labor partners. These were all decisions that we could make without engaging a change to our collective bargaining agreements. And these were with the intent to delay the state takeover. So as I shared before, our anticipated ending balance at June 30th, and we'll go into this, the next slide, is not negative.
So the question was, how many people lost their jobs?
Not positions that were empty that you chose not to replace, but how many people got a pink slip in effect?
Well, I'm going to look and make sure I get this correct, because we had the similar question last time, and the reduction in force figure or number was 397 positions. Now, there may have been some vacancies in that number, but that was the number that were reduced in the spring board meetings.
And it also doesn't account for other attrition, for example, people who retire, and so that is still a process that is playing out right now. We will actually have, as part of the process, also one where once all of that is done, there may still be opportunities for certain positions with certain credentials that we might still need. But it's something that we're still monitoring. But yes, there was a reduction in force that totaled that amount of positions.
And will those pink-slipped people be first offered? Will they receive the first offer for rehire?
That is part of the collective bargaining agreement. I think it's up to 39
months.
Yeah, 39 months. They have first priority, if you will. And in the case of Member Morawski's example, I mean, some of those layoff notices are rescinded once we've identified the resources to bring back those positions.
So, and to reiterate, these are positions that are identified for a reduction based on legal parameters and collective bargaining agreements. There's something called bumping, where depending on your years with the district, you may displace somebody else, and it takes a domino effect. So we're still working through the actual individuals that are affected by this process.
So with these cuts, what does that mean for schools? Like, assuming there's 397 positions that are going to be cut. I don't know how many are teachers, how many are what, but what does that mean for? And I understand that some class sizes will be bigger potentially, or I don't know how that plays out in the district. Like, so what is the impact of 397 positions being taken out?
So, for example, part of that 397, 178 are certificated positions. And as I referenced the one-stop staffing process, that was where we ensured that all schools were brought down to the contract maximums with respect to class sizes. And so there could be some service level impact with a change in class size, but that's something that could happen year over year depending on the enrollment at a particular site. And so definitely that's something that there's obviously an impact when 178 teacher positions are displaced. But again, that was through right-sizing process at central office to really look at what the needs of a site are and to better maximize how we're using our staff.
Like most other districts in the state, we are seeing declining enrollment, so when Ms. Watkins talks about right-sizing and the fact that these were cuts that didn't require negotiations, it's because in the contract we have a certain number of students for every teacher. And so we essentially did a lot of analysis to say, okay, that shouldn't be impacted, because then we'd have to negotiate. We'd have to say, well, then we have to sit down and say, hey, we want to increase class size. So this is right-sizing based on those enrollment figures, if you will.
Superintendent, can you just tell us, like, currently per contract, how many children per class and which grade levels?
Yeah, like elementary, it's 1 to 24.
K3.
For K3. And so in the example that I'm giving here, we essentially did the analysis to make sure that we don't go over 24 students for every teacher. And those were the ways that we identified how many positions we could reduce. It's a very complicated process, but we are bound by the CBA, by the collective bargaining agreement, to have to negotiate if we increase that class size. We're not there yet. We haven't been taken over. Those are the kinds of decisions that I would imagine an administrator would be making, but for now, all of those decisions were based on the actual collective bargaining agreement.
And to piggyback off that comment and something Member Morawski mentioned, our class sizes are also set in education code, and our collective bargaining agreements are pretty closely aligned to those requirements.
How many employees does the district have? Like, how many admin and how many support and how many teachers are employed here?
I'll go into percentages by bargaining unit, but as far as the overall total, it's over 4,000. We pay, I think, over 7,000 when you start considering part-time and volunteers and students and all the people that we pay through the district. But there's like 4,300, I think, full-time, not full-time, 4,300 permanent employees.
And with all these cuts that are being made, I've been hearing that we're not going to have school resource officers any longer at our district. Is that true?
I don't know if I can speak to that, but you can, Superintendent.
Well, again, it's we currently have a contract that expires on June 30th for school resource officers. And we are right now in the process, as with everything else, looking at ways in which we might be able to mitigate if we were to cut programs like the SRO program. what other alternatives might there be to make sure that we're still providing a safe learning environment to our students. The board will make a decision before June 20th, which is our last board meeting for the fiscal year, because that will be right before the contract expires. So again, it's something that the board has requested that we look at other alternatives that would still ensure that we have a safe learning environment for our students.
Can I just key in there? I want to make it clear to our community that I've been working closely with the superintendent and staff in our area. It is troublesome because we are in the county here, correct? And we don't really get services from Rancho PD, right? We don't get services from SAC PD. And if we call 911, there is a long wait time, right? So I'm working closely with the superintendent and to make sure that we have something here that's going to work for our area.
2 points of clarification. One is, when you gave the 300 some odd number for the layoff, is that the actual number, or is, I know that from my understanding is there's like, you have to give out like, I think 3 or 4 notices for each actual layoff. Is that a misunderstanding, or?
That's the number of positions or full-time equivalents. I believe they're noticed, there's a process in how they're noticed, and you have to serve it and have it duly noted, and but I'm not sure that there's multiple notices.
I will mention that the number of positions totaled 179, but through the attrition process, it will likely not be 179 individuals. And again, that's still a process that's playing out, but it likely will not be the total 179 positions that were reduced.
Can you go over about how?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to follow up on that point, and that is, maybe one thing that softened the blow up a little bit was to realize, based on information provided to the board at a prior meeting, that even through the recession and when the layoff totals were much higher, the district was able to reabsorb all of the laid off employees. And even though, obviously it causes a lot of havoc and disruption, but we were able to reabsorb those employees.
Can you go over how decisions about layoffs for teachers are made in the district, and are there any school sites that might be impacted more by the way that this is done?
The process is seniority based, so once we've assessed the need, then the Human Resources Department takes a look at all teachers and based on how many years of service they have with the district. And so there is definitely an impact when there's what I refer to as bumping, where someone is more senior but maybe had not been at a particular school site, and they might displace somebody that had just started at that school site. But it looks at solely at years of service and district-wide.
And I guess the question I have is there are some school sites that have a lot of teachers that have less years of experience in Sac City, particularly schools that have students that have more poverty. So are those schools going to be impacted more by these layoffs?
No, the answer would be no, because it goes back to what's in the collective bargaining agreement. So we still have to maintain those ratios. But yes, there's long-standing research that shows that our most neediest schools tend to have our newest teachers. And as Ms. Watkins stated, the layoff process does include that notion of, if you're the last person hired, you're the first person that is laid off because of seniority. And I know that at another community gathering, I think there was some advocacy around that of course we have wonderful teachers who are in their first, second, third year, but because of that seniority rule, they may be outstanding teachers, but it's purely based on that seniority.
I also just wanted to point out real fast, we're not quite halfway through the presentation, but halfway through our evening. So I do have cards. If you want to write things down, I can get answers to you in the form of an FAQ on our website.
Really, this will be quick. There are a lot of discussion about, how come we're not just cutting all of the district office, right? So one of the question I have is, when you hear that a gate coordinator is being, getting laid off, or I don't know, again, you guys have so many acronym, insert blank, coordinator being laid off. People say, well, why don't we just cut 170 of you people in the Crystal Tower? Can you explain that concept of what exactly does a gate coordinator do versus, I know that there are gate teachers, in a lot of schools, but what exactly does that mean? So when we have friends who are teachers and say, you know what, just get rid of all the administrator, we don't need that many of them. What does that mean?
Well, certainly we have to do a better job of clarifying and explaining the role that central office provide. I mean, certainly it's a supportive role. And in most cases, we typically have just one person in charge of many, many bodies of work. So yes, we have one person that oversees the administration of our GATE program. But that person also oversees the administration of our AP program. So unlike every other urban district that I'm aware of, we have many staff that wear several hats because we have very few administrators. We have one visual performing arts person in the district. We do not have one foreign language person in the district. Even though we have dual immersion programs, we don't have anybody that is ensuring that our world languages across the district are taught effectively and with high rigor. We don't have somebody responsible for history, social science in the district. We have one person who's in charge of all science curriculum for the entire district. So we just haven't done a good job of making our community aware that I also don't think as superintendent that it is acceptable not to have at least one individual per subject area that can give us the confidence that our students are being exposed and that we're supporting our teachers and our principals to make sure that we're providing first-tier teaching to all of our students. It's a very difficult narrative because there are many school districts that do have a lot of administrative functions and individuals. But I can tell you that in my less than 2 years in Sac City, I was very surprised that we don't have, for example, a world languages coordinator for the entire district. Particularly because Sac City, as you know, is very committed to dual immersion programs. And so the quality of those programs is dispersed onto our school sites. We don't have the ability to make sure that, that all of that is taking place as we think it should be taking place. We have wonderful foreign languages, and we've got to make sure that we're providing professional development to our teachers, to our staff, to make sure that our students are, again, accessing first-tier teaching and instruction. So we just haven't done a good job of that. We have joked that maybe we should have tours of the CERNA Center so that you can see. I mean, I'll tell you, in less than 2 years, one thing that I've realized is we have a lot of small conference rooms, and at some point somebody made the decision to call them after states. I, as superintendent, don't know where all those conference rooms are, but those were formerly offices that at one time were filled at the CERNA Center. And so if anyone, I would ask that if you know of anyone that has worked in the CERNA Center, that you get their perspective as well. We just haven't done an effective job of communicating that to our community. And so for that, I apologize, and we really do need to do a better job of that.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on what it means to lose, like the gate coordinator, for example. It means that school sites will develop their own maybe standards to assess for gate. I can tell you that as a parent of 2 kids who are in GATE now, they got tested in first grade. So that assessment is part of this, the duties of this coordinator. One passed, I guess, the assessment, the other one didn't. In second grade, the teacher recommended that she get retested. So this was all coordinated through the GATE coordinator at the district office, and it's accommodating that additional assessment. And so my concern as a parent, and not only as a school board member, is that we're going to lose that consistency across school sites, because it's going to get rolled back to the school site, and that's going to vary tremendously depending on the type of support and experience school sites have with all of these tests, right? And at the end of the day, it's about equity. It's ensuring that all our promising young learners have access to these assessments early on and as frequently as it's necessary in order to make sure that they're properly placed, that they're in the proper educational setting for where they're at, right, as learners. So that's one example that I can just give a little bit more context as someone who's living our school district and our system on a regular basis.
Thank you. Can I just bump in real quick? I want to say that I'm glad the superintendent mentioned about how many people are in the Cerna Center and doing tours, right? Because it's pretty amazing. We really are working with bare bones. If you think of the work that comes out, the communication that comes out from our district, it's usually one person, like in the communications department, right, that's doing all of the work for our entire district. And as your board and your board member that represents your area, looking at the Cerna Center and cuts was the very first place that our minds went. And that's the first place that we started making the cuts. We wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to affect our kids and our classrooms, right? So I appreciate the superintendent mentioning that, but I don't have the numbers in front of me. Superintendent, I don't know if you know them off the top of your head, but do you know, I know once we had a handout or a slide at one of our board meetings about what our percentage was at the Cerna Center as far as staff ratios compared to our neighboring districts. It's coming up? Oh.
Yeah, it is coming up. And before Ms. Del Agua just mentions this, I mean, just know that, again, an invitation for you to come to our June 6th and June 20th board meeting. We are still actively doing everything we can to try to figure out if there are different funding sources and funding mechanisms to make sure that that we can see if there's ways that some of these individuals can continue working in Sac City Unified. In the case of the GATE coordinator, for example, we are under investigation by the Office of Civil Rights, the U.S. Office of Civil Rights, because we have a disproportionate number of African American and EL students, English learner students, in our GATE program. That is, compared to the number of African American students in our district, compared to the number of English learners in our district, there are very, very few African American and English learner students in our district. So we are under investigation currently by the Office of Civil Rights. One of the things that we implemented so that we could demonstrate that we were committed to equity, that Member Garcia just mentioned, is we made a commitment to provide universal screening, universal testing for all of our students. It used to be, as I understand, but this was also in my last post in Fresno, screening was done based on teacher recommendations. And so if you were a student, I don't know, at John Sloat, for example, and you weren't recommended to take the GATE assessment, then you didn't take the GATE assessment. So by providing a universal screening, which again required somebody to administer, coordinate, take it to school sites, score it and such, we actually saw an increase in the number of EL and African American youth over the past 2 years who became GATE certified. Those are the kinds of functions that would suffer by eliminating that position. And again, we're actively looking if there are other funding sources so that we can bring back some of those positions, because we have been told, and many of our community members have provided public comment, that without those services, they will likely go to a different district because they want the best for their children. And for some of the children, if we can't provide assurances that we're going to be able to provide those supports, then they might look elsewhere to enroll their children. And we don't want that to happen, of course.
One other thing I just want to add is that coordinator also provides all the professional development for all the teachers so that teachers can get GATE certified. So without her, you won't have any new teachers getting GATE certified unless they go and pay for it on their own through a college. But then it's at a cost. Right now through the district, it's free. Plus with all of the regulations, she has to make sure that everything's being implemented and fulfilled. And then they do testing, screening across the board in first and third. So, one's paper, pencil, one's technology-based. So there's a lot more. And then with the AP, she does all the piloting of the new textbooks that high schools get and facilitates all of that. So it's quite a bit that one person does.
Here comes Donahue.
And this last question, and then we'll get back to the slides.
When you mentioned we're bare bones at the Cerna Center, I know that place is huge and it's not being utilized to its capacity because it's pretty empty. Do you guys own that building or do you rent that building? And then my other question is, because it must cost a ton to run, it's huge and it's not full. And my other question is, do you plan on closing any school sites that aren't full? Do you have any, or like some of these smaller specialized schools, is that part of the plan?
So the Cerna Center we own, we constructed that building. We have in the past leased out space, and we had a previous partnership with the city in the location to maximize our use of the space. As far as closing of schools, that has not been on the table for discussion at this point in time. Back in 2010, and with the previous fiscal crisis, that was something, for those of you that were part of the district at that time may remember, but at this point that has not been presented to the board. We're trying to address as many cuts and savings that aren't going to impact students.
I would also say that certainly it's a consideration, and it's something that has to be looked at very seriously. As I understand, probably not the same way that it was done several years ago. So we would want to make sure that we're very intentional and that we look at everything that is necessary to look at before we make those decisions. It is a fact that unlike most urban school districts, Sac City Unified does operate very small elementary schools. And I'll tell you, as superintendent, I was at Theodore Judah, for example, this morning visiting a first grader who was principal for the day, which was a great way to start my day. But the fact that we have all of our elementary schools tucked in beautiful neighborhoods, I think makes Sac City very unique. But in terms of economies of scale, we have to allocate a certain amount of money for every school site, regardless of how many students attend. And so a school with 200 students costs us the same amount to operate as a school with about 450 students. In most urban school districts, you're not going to find the vast majority of its schools like ours with 250, 230 students. In my last post in Fresno, most of our schools had over 600 students. But again, it's just how do we balance keeping some of those very unique characteristics of Sac City Unified by looking at other ways in which we can address this deficit, and we'll actually get to it in a few slides. But without, if we're not successful addressing some of the areas that we are looking at very seriously, then of course those are the kinds of things that an administrator more quickly would look at But I know that Member Morawski through FTAC has expressed an interest at also sort of looking at this much more intentionally and carefully and not rushing into a decision and making sure that the decision is a solid one with a lot of support and a lot of community feedback as well.
Superintendent, can I just say that I think it's also important to say that in 2013, early 2013, we closed 7 schools. There was proposed to close 11, we closed 7. And correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the actual savings after the loss of ADA was roughly about $2 million for closing 7 schools.
Just to share the context of that, we still have the minimum teacher-student ratios that we have to maintain. So it's more the footprint at each school site and the administrator positions that would achieve the savings, and that's why the dollar impact is very low. So we're still serving the same number of students. In the interest of time, I'm going to one more question, and I want to.
What happens to the school building when it is abandoned? Is it sold? Is it torn down and developed for housing, or
no?
And do you pay to?
Actually, so that there's a process that has to take place, and so the first in line is usually charters. If we say that we're going to sell it, if we of our 7 schools, we repurposed those sites. There was one school that opened up as a parent-driven charter, which was New Joseph Bonheim, and then we had other schools that opened up as community centers in our neighborhoods.
Okay, we're going to push forward here. If I start going too fast, slow me down. I want to address everything that you have to ask, but also what we have in the presentation. On this slide, this is a representation of what went to the board 2 weeks ago for our 3rd interim. This is what was presented to the Sacramento County Office of Education. They do not allow us to show any planned reductions unless we can identify where those savings will be achieved. So this plan does reflect that we have still deficit spending in the first column, that negative $16 million figure in 18-19. But we still have a positive ending balance. This is the unrestricted general fund, and we still have a sufficient reserve. However, as we move forward, as it stands now with the current cuts that we've made, we project to have a negative ending balance in 2020-21 and inadequate reserves, as we have a negative 0.6% reserve at the end of that year. And if we did nothing more, we'd expect to run out of cash in October of 2020. So how do we spend our dollars presently? And this is where we look at what we call outlier expenses. Outlier expenses are how we spend in comparison to other school districts. So the first slide we have here shows that 91 cents on every dollar is spent out of the unrestricted general fund on salaries and benefit costs. On average, other school districts spend approximately 85% of the unrestricted general fund on employee salaries and benefits. And what this difference of 85 to 91% for us is approximately $21 million. So in reference to the previous slide, that would close our structural deficit where we're spending more than we're receiving of that $16 million and still leave about $5 million to spend on student programs. So to further show you how our unrestricted general fund dollars are spent, after that 91%, that leaves roughly 9 cents on every dollar that are spent on operational costs. So that would be anything that we spend on running our programs, paying our utility costs, buying supplies. So this slide, we made reference to this quite frequently previously, and hopefully this will give you some context on how our labor groups are divided out across our unrestricted general fund. So of this, the 91%, $316.5 million is spent on the salary and benefit costs. The teachers represent approximately 70%. Our SEIU members, which is our Service Employees International Union, those are our instructional aides, our custodians, our bus drivers, and our office staff. They represent 17%. Our United Professional Educators are our principals and our assistant principals. They represent 6%. Our unrepresented management, so this would be your reference to the central office administrators, they're less than 4%. Our Teamsters members represent 2%, and these are, as an example, our plant managers or those that are running your facility operations. Our Teamsters supervisors, these are our maintenance and cafeteria supervisors, they're less than 0.2%. And then the remaining 1.5% or just under 1.5% are unrepresented employees. These are the coordinators that we referenced, our department level supervisors, as well as ROTC teachers. So what are our options for closing our budget deficit? Back in December of 2018, when our Fiscal Crisis Management Assistance Team presented their report, their executive director said to focus on, look at where your outliers are. And those are where we're spending greater than on average other school districts. And so for tonight's presentation, we decided to look at just 2 of our outliers. The first being special education, the second being health benefits. So how do we compare with our special education spend as compared to other school districts? So presently, the district's unrestricted general fund contributes $84 million towards special education funding. And in context, the district receives about 10% of its funding for special education from federal dollars. This is quite less than what was anticipated of approximately 40% from our federal government. But currently that represents about 10% of what they originally had promised to school districts for special education funding. So the balance is made up of both state dollars and local contributions, which would be our general fund contribution. On average, school districts contribute about 64.5% from their unrestricted general fund to fund their special education programs. We contribute about 68%, and that represents roughly $5 million for our school district. Another outlier expense for us are our health benefit costs. As I've referred to previously, we pay for district-paid health benefits 100% for our employees and their families for a majority of our employees. So on average, as well as for our maximum costs, we're greater than all other school districts in the region. On average, the maximum rate that we pay over all of our plans is close to $35,000 a year. That affects about 550 of our employees out of those 4,000 that I referred to. That amounts to $19 million a year in expenditures for those 500 employees. So offering a similar benefit at a lower cost would definitely help the district close its structural deficit. Just to illustrate this a little further, we currently get funded for our students at approximately $10,000 per year for their average daily attendance. So that's assuming that each student attends every day of school will get on average $10,000 a year. Now back in 2016-17, on this slide, we got about $9,300 a year. As compared to the spend that we spent for both our current employees' healthcare and for retirees, as well as our contribution towards paying for future retiree healthcare premiums, we spent about $2,500 per student each year. So that's over 26% of the funds that we received for our students are spent on healthcare costs alone. And of course, that's higher than any other district from in 2016-17. The average that was spent is roughly 15%, so that's that differential for an outlier. We spent almost 11% greater than on average other unified school districts, and that amount, that difference, is about $46 million a year for us. Mm-hmm.
Are they across all bargaining units?
That premium amount is specific to our teachers group at the highest paid plan.
So no other bargaining unit has someone that you pay $35,000 for?
No.
And just to clarify, these are just the facts that both sides, the management and the union, concur with, or do they say that no, those are your facts and we show a different number?
We can provide data to support those numbers.
I haven't seen any information contesting, if you go back, contesting the amount that we pay for either the average or the maximum. This is paid specifically to, in this case, this is HealthNet. So it's what we have to pay for the family, employee, spouse, and family. It's the $34,800. I haven't seen that figure contested, and of course we'd be happy to share, that is the actual premium charged by HealthNet. The other challenge with this is that in the case of our teachers union, HealthNet is written into the collective bargaining agreement. In other words, it specifically states that we have to provide HealthNet as one of the options. And so you can imagine that if you are HealthNet, if you were the CEO, you know that we have to provide your insurance, you wouldn't have any reason to charge us less. This is something that's very concerning to us, that also is negotiable because it is in the collective bargaining agreement. On top of it, this is a very high amount because in our contract we are obligated to pay 100% of health coverage, which is unlike other school districts throughout the state or the region. In cases like Natoma's, I would imagine that $12,000 figure is probably a cap. In other words, doesn't matter how much we're charged because the market in healthcare is just going up, obviously, right? So I think they would probably their cap would say, we will pay $12,000 because we don't know how much it's going to cost us in the future. We don't have that. We pay for 100%, and again, we're obligated at the moment to pay for HealthNet as one of the plans. We also offer others. We offer Kaiser, but we are obligated under our contract to continue to provide HealthNet at 100%. Well,
good question.
I don't know why that is. This is this is a long-standing provision in the collective bargaining agreement that predates, I think, every board member and certainly me.
I could say at the time, and this was decided pre-me as well, but there may have been various reasons why it seemed to be beneficial at the time. We don't know if it was provider networks or whatnot, but that was what was bargained at the time. And as you referenced, they're one of two that are offered to both active teachers as well as retired teachers. They have access to HealthNet and Kaiser per the contract.
Can you explain? Can you also explain to us who is covered and to what extent, after they retire, are their families covered?
As far as the vesting and all the
yes,
detail?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, I'm going to jump back, follow up on the end of his question, and I appreciate Superintendent answering because at the bottom of this slide it does give reference to a report from the State Department of Education. So this is publicly available information, and we do have rate sheets provided on our district website. So as he referenced, I don't think there's been any dispute to these numbers. With respect to the vesting, I can certainly, it might even be on our website, but there's very specific detail on how many years of service you have to work by bargaining group in order to receive a lifetime benefit. As an active employee, if you work over 4 hours, so we have some employees that their full-time equivalent position is less than 4 hours, but for those, anything 4 hours and above are considered full-time, and they have access to employer-paid benefits, and most of the bargaining units they receive 100% for both employee and family.
Thank you. Just one clarifying question. So the $34,000, the highest that we pay, that's for the highest paid employee?
No.
No.
So that is a family plan. So as Superintendent mentioned, that would be for an employee, a spouse, and their family members.
Correct.
That is the annual amount of the cost for that plan, and because the district pays 100% of the premium, it's a district cost, not an employee cost. So, and
We're talking about healthcare and comparing ourselves with other districts, but what about salaries? Because what I've been hearing is that other districts actually pay their teachers more, and that's why they're choosing to go to other districts.
So in our last contract negotiations, it's referred to as total compensation. Our total compensation packages, I think, are equal or maybe exceeding all other neighboring districts at this point between the benefits and the salary package. So while there might be some districts that have a little bit higher salary in certain areas, they certainly in the total compensation do not exceed our district.
Can you explain the joining into a bigger pool of, do you know where I'm going with this? Can you please explain that?
Yeah, so what we have been trying to accomplish is creating, well, current reality is that, as Ms. Watkins said, some of our bargaining partners are very small, 50, 200, and historically, the way that the district has managed its healthcare benefit structure is that each of those bargaining units have negotiated individually. So the idea of having a stronger pool by all of us joining one pool would give us much more leverage when we negotiate with health plan providers. We have 5 total bargaining partners, and what we're trying to do is get all 5 bargaining partners to join in one pool and have more negotiating power to get lower premium rates from any number of healthcare providers. We have been working with a health broker who has estimated that if we all came together into that one pool and switched plans, that we could save anywhere between $11 and $16 million, 1/6. That would mean that we would all have the same providers, still comparable benefits, because under the collective bargaining agreements, we still would have to pay 100% of health plan costs to, say, our teachers. That's not the case with other bargaining partners. Other bargaining partners do have caps, for example. They might say we pay for 100%, but it's only up to whatever Kaiser Permanente charges. In cases like us as unrepresented management, I think, for example, it's 100% for me as an employee, up to 75% for my family, for example. So there's different, we're not talking about changing everybody to the same type of benefit plan structure. We're just talking about all of us having the same health plan providers. And so that's what we've been seeking to do, and having given up hope. 4 of our bargaining partners have said that, yes, they would be willing to all go into that pool and select the same provider. We're continuing to hope that our largest, which is our teachers union, they make up about 51% of our total employees. The other 4 make up about 48% of our total employees. And so we're hoping that we can all arrive to that agreement.
And just the 5 partners for a bigger pool. It's not joining with the state employees.
No.
Other entities' employees.
No.
I have a question on that. So I don't know if you can answer this or if it's too long, but what's the process of actually making that change? Because SCTA says, well, the district didn't do what they needed to do to make that change. I don't know if the district is saying SCTA, because I know they have to then pick, and there's a process through that, and it's kind of like you know, you didn't do your end, and now we're kind of stuck where we still don't have any savings 2 years later, where we could have solved, you know, $34 million in debt by doing this 2 years ago when it was agreed. And so it's kind of like he said, she said, you didn't do your part.
Well, I actually asked our staff for an update on this because what our health broker has said is, and this was a health broker that was agreed upon by all of our partners, including our teachers union as well, that we were to make those switches of health plan providers by July 1st of 2018. That was a year ago. And I wanted to get an update on where we stood for the possibility of making the plan changes a year later, July 1 of 2019. We would be unable to make the changes by July 1st because it's about a month away, and there'd be thousands of employees, as you know, that would have to make changes, process documentation, etc. They have said, they told us last week that they would require about 3 to 4 months of advance notice in order to be able to make that entire change. But the other update that I asked for to your question, Mr. Lagua, is what have we done or not done? And I was disturbed to learn that we have paid over $250,000 to this broker who we contracted to help us make these plan switches. And so we have communicated to our teachers union that if there is no intention to make the plan switches, then we really should be thinking about whether to continue the contract just to have a health broker make calculations on our behalf, but they're actually not resulting in the changes that must occur. So I am not aware of any actions that we have not taken. For example, we haven't paid them. So we have a contract that I think gives us a 90-day an opportunity to cancel the contract with 90 days notice. And I just think, to your point, because we didn't effectuate those changes a year ago, we've continued to pay this health broker essentially just to keep running numbers for us as health plan providers release new rates on an ongoing basis, because rates continue to change. That we would probably have to look at whether to continue that contract or not.
I'm going to make a comment. I'm sitting here, and it's just I'm going to strongly suggest, as moving forward, this is not a change that can happen this year, next year, probably even in the next 10 years, but at some point look at, for new employees, having them go into the Social Security Medicare system and providing a more modest pension, whether it's a 401k or a modest pension like the federal government has, along with the 401k, whatever combination. Social Security is cheaper in the long run, and that $700 million unfunded liability is not sustainable.
Thank you for that comment. We actually, all employees except for our teachers do pay into Social Security. All employees pay into Medicare. And so as far as the other pension plans as opposed to a 401k, we have requirements in law for offering our employees both CalPERS and CalSTRS as a retirement system. And we do offer like 457 and 403B supplemental plans. Our lifetime benefits extend beyond what Medicare provides. So Medicare provides some limitations. For example, they pay 80% of costs. Our lifetime benefit makes a full package, so it provides the supplemental and the prescription drug program that maybe Medicare doesn't provide.
So it makes it 100%, it isn't 100% by itself.
No, Medicare is very complex, but it does not provide a full package, and most over 65 have to look at going out on the marketplace to get their own supplemental programs. In providing our lifetime benefit, we provide that to our retirees, and they are required to participate in Medicare. There was a small select few that started with the district prior to 1984 when it was required to participate in Medicare, and we've made an arrangement where we help contribute towards those costs so they get the Medicare rate, which is a savings for the district. Time checking here, we're just past 8. Are you all going to keep proceeding? Okay. So I thank Superintendent for elaborating on this next slide, the $11 to $16 million, that checker, which is the acronym, and please don't ask me to define that acronym because I know I'll mess that one up. But the healthcare collective, we refer to them as checker. They've identified these potential savings. These savings, again, were absent changes to service level or benefits that were provided. It was just the carriers that would be providing the benefits. So it would be same access to doctor and medical groups, same hospital groups for the employees, so they wouldn't see a change in service level or benefit provision. So next steps, where do we go from here? This is that same slide, I think it was slide 13. There's nothing different here. I do want to point out we do show 4 years, which is different from what was presented at third interim. Because we're approaching our next budget cycle with our adopted budget, we have provided the 2021-22 to see the impact of our proposed changes. Our deficit spending, we have less than adequate reserves, and without any further cuts, we will run out of cash. So we have come up, along with our consultants, with a recommended plan on how to balance our 3 goals, which is, again, eliminating deficit spending. We're not going to spend more than we receive. Trying to build a reserve of 4%, and I'll go in a little further on why that's prudent or important. And then also to buy us some time to come up with this negotiated solution with respect to benefits and other terms of the collective bargaining agreements. So I'll take you first to the bottom 3 lines. The third line up, you'll see some numbers. This is the only thing different from that previous slide of the third interim report. It shows an amount of $29 million and $5 million. These are the amounts that we have placed into our proposed budget for the next upcoming 3 years to see how we would achieve those 3 goals. So how would we get rid of our deficit spending concern? How would we build a reserve? And how would we buy time? And that's why that $29 million isn't immediately in 1920. I will share that any cuts, like the cuts and savings we've already identified, does have a compounding effect. So if, for example, we find $10 million in savings in this current year, that could grow to $30 million over these 3 years. So that's not to say that we're not continuing this effort to find additional savings and opportunities, but that this was the amount that we would need in order to achieve those goals.
I do want to clarify something for our community. The difference between this slide and the previous slide is that the previous slide, if you go to it, Ms. Watkins, that slide is the slide that we submitted, that the information that we submitted to SCOE, that they are reviewing and will have a response to us in the next several days. The Sacramento County Office of Education, who oversees our budget. They have oversight of our budget. So the idea that when Ms. Watkins says that what we adopted, this is what we submitted to the County Office of Education. And you can see at the very bottom that we do not have at the 2% minimum required reserve starting in 2021. And that's because what SCOE requires is that we have identified the cuts that we would have made in order to consider them as part of our plan. We are trying to identify savings, but they are dependent on our ability to negotiate those savings through negotiations. SCOE, and I think virtually any county office, does not allow us to say, can you please believe us that we're going to negotiate those savings, and we're going to submit a proposal that actually takes that into consideration. So I want to be very clear to our community because I think there's been confusion. This is what SCOE is reviewing because we do not have the cuts identified, the savings identified. We haven't materialized, they haven't happened. The staff recommended plan, which is the one that Ms. Watkins is reviewing, is the one that we are striving for. And so when she said the one that we adopted, it's simply that we presented it to the board and said, this is what we'd like to strive for. But it's not what SCOE is reviewing or approving or denying. This is our internal recommended multi-year plan.
Thank you, Superintendent, for re-emphasizing that.
So just to clarify, so when I hear our teacher friend, they show us, what the union has sent out, so this is not $35 million that was found, because, that's what we've been hearing, and I understand, I guess, that the district or from management, you have more constraint on what you can and cannot share versus, like you said earlier, the lack of communication, the misunderstanding of it, because we hear a lot of it from other sides, but then, when I see some of these charts and graphs, they're saying, I've not seen these before. So I don't know if there's anything else you could do, because again, this has just been very helpful, but as you can see, the room is not quite full.
Yeah.
And if you have 4 of these already, I know they're being webcasted. Just texted my sister. I say, I'm on TV, you can see me. And she say, oh yeah, I'm not really watching it right now.
Well.
So help.
Sure. I know our board members are individually doing everything they can. Tomorrow morning, I'll be at one of our school sites having coffee, donuts with parents as well. We're trying to do everything we can to communicate what we think is appropriate and what we also think is factual. The reason why I wanted to make sure that I made the distinction is because I've also heard the idea that now we've adopted a 4% reserve, for example. Again, this is what we've been told, is that in preparation for an economic downturn, we should not strive to have a 2% minimum reserve, because just as quickly as SCOE would approve our budget, it would disapprove our budget, as soon as an economic downturn starts to hit. So we're simply saying that we want to make sure that we have the resources to provide fair compensation to our employees, that we have the resources to invest in students and student programs, and that we have funds available to prepare for economic uncertainties. But 4% is still a relatively low amount compared to what the average reserve amount is for most school districts in the state of California, which is above 10%. To give you a sense of this, a 2% reserve in a budget of $530 million is about $11 million. That's what we're required to have by law. And if we can demonstrate that 2 years out, then our budget is approved. But 2 years out, we don't know what's going to happen with our budget. And so if it's approved and then next year the budget, we struggle a little bit, then it would be disapproved. But to give you a sense, $11 million with the size of our payroll and utilities and expenses to operate our district would last us about 14 to 15 days.
It wouldn't even be that.
Not even that. So multiplying that by 2 would still not be a lot of cushion for us. But again, this is not what SCOE is reviewing. It's what we want to work toward. And our board has also indicated an interest. The board actually doesn't have a policy on reserves. That is, as a body, we haven't said, in the best of economic times, like the ones we're still living today, we should strive to have no less than this amount of a reserve. And so we also want to change that, and it's a discussion point in our policy committee. So just as Member Morawski oversees our Fiscal Transparency and Accountability Committee, there's another board committee that looks at governance and policy issues. And one of the policies that they're considering is setting a policy on reserves that they would then direct me as their superintendent to direct our business office to create a plan that has us meeting that policy.
Thank
And
you,
it was.
Superintendent.
It was 14.6%
2 years ago.
2 years ago.
Which has probably helped us now, because we're now using those reserves. But I have a quick question. So when you submit it to SCOE, are they only approving the next year, or do they have to improve 3 years out?
Yes.
Current plus 2.
Pardon?
Current year plus 2. So when we submitted the third interim, it didn't include this final column, but it was the present year plus 2 more years.
But our 2021 is deficient, there's not enough money. Will they approve a budget when your third year, you don't have enough money?
That's why we're disapproved.
Yeah.
Up to this point.
Yeah.
So, but for the budget that you have to submit by June 30th, that one then would have to be this year or next year plus 2 more?
Exactly, yes. The only
We're
reason
still
why.
deficit spending, so we
Exactly.
still
Yeah.
don't have enough, so then they still wouldn't approve it?
The deficit
Correct.
spending isn't the trigger for the county office for their oversight. It's the fact if we have the deficient reserves and the negative fund balance. So there's been circumstances where districts and ourselves have spent in deficit, but we've dipped into our available reserves, and that's okay. That doesn't give us the negative certification.
But on this one, there's not enough reserves in.
We actually have a negative ending balance and insufficient reserves, so the combination of both is what disapproves our budget.
And so on the budget that gets turned in June 30th, that won't be the case?
So next week's board meeting on June 6th, the staff is coming forward with, and it will show since third interim what we've done with the adopted budget and our plans moving forward for this upcoming year and the 2 years after that.
We just felt, Ms. Delagua, that in the staff recommended multi-year, that we would include that third year because we were just a few weeks away from adopting a budget. But again, these interim reports are just that. They kind of give you a sense of where you stand. So since we submitted the third interim, our staff have been putting in countless hours, as Member Morawski has said, turning every rock, to see if we can identify other resources and other funding sources that we can apply differently than we have in the past. And we have brought in a couple of consultants with a lot of experience in entitlement funds, Title I, Title II, Title III, state funding and other sources to help us be creative about ways in which we might continue to fund some programs that we haven't funded in the past, using and capitalizing on those rules, if you will. So the third interim will likely look a little bit different than what we actually adopt, and that's why that 2 years out, which appears in the third year right now, will only appear 2 years out after June 30th.
The requirement is a 2% reserve and not a negative in the fund balance. That's the
Or negative cash, which would preempt the takeover. So, yeah.
I have 2 clarifying questions just on timing because of the state budget won't be approved until June 15th and you're having your meeting on June 6th and there's potential for some funds coming, additional funds coming from the state. How do you deal with that timing?
We have a 2-part process. It'll come forward on June 6th, but it won't get adopted by the board until June 20th. And then there's a process called a 45-day revision. So following the approval of the state budget, we come back to the board if there's significant changes, and we modify that in the August timeframe.
And then my other question is, because so many of this, the assumption is that any future savings will likely need to be negotiated. We know that the SCTA contract is up in June 30th. Are the other 4 up this year as well? So that you'll be negotiating all 5 contracts presumably in the next.
All the other partners have also sunshined their proposals, so there's elements of the contract that we are negotiating. So yes, we would be working with all of them. And in the case of the other 4 labor partners, they have formed what they call a labor management consortium, which came out of an effort that tries to change labor management relations between labor and management. And they decided to form this consortium. And at least for the initial phases of the negotiations process, when you set the norms and sort of what is our guiding principle, what are we striving for, typically those are done separately They asked that they all be in the room together as a labor management consortium, all kind of agreeing on what is our sort of our North Star for how we're going to shift the way in which we work together. And so that's also something that we're hoping that we will see in the future in Sac City, is all of our labor partners working together. In fact, all the research shows that when you have those kinds of relationships, student achievement goes up. You don't have these kinds of budget challenges, or at least you have the ability to overcome some of these challenges, not having to address what this gentleman continues to remind us of different facts and different arguments. You know, we hope that we can work together more closely and in collaboration.
Yes.
I apologize. I was going to try and wait till the end, but I'll make sure I get my question in. My name is Eli Basson. I spoke at the first QBD meeting, and I refined my questions, went through, reread everything again. I just want to restate two of my points real quick. We talked about all the threats of it, the enrollment decline in the school district falling apart, and then that's kind of self-fulfilling where people are then afraid to go to the school. And so I just want to throw it again. Hopefully we can come up with like image campaign. Maybe the band plays at basketball games with the mayor can get them in or something. You know, I'm not that's not my skill set, but I'm sure there's 1,000 ways, and we all have 100 stories of great student stories to get new parents excited about how great our district is. Last week I talked about alternative fundraising ideas of the taxes and you know, donations, things like that. I spent a lot of time, I talked about the enrollment projections last time, and I gave my mini anecdotal census of one block, and then I tried to look at the trends of the last 7 years. I could go back, like I found about 12 years back of the trends, and to me it seems really close to flat, and I couldn't replicate exactly, and I mentioned last time, hopefully we could kind of see the math and the analysis, and everyone wasn't exactly sure. On page 15, I can cite my references now on the fiscal health risk analysis from, I think, 18 months ago by the FCMAT folks. Page 15 of that one, they talked about how the district's enrollment projections were not done the way they thought we should be doing them. And so I was wondering on a follow-up on that finding from 18 months ago. I couldn't answer that question myself, and I can't describe exactly what they're talking about in their paragraph summary about cohort analyses and things like that. But based on my estimate, it seems like our projections will be half as bad as what the most recent thing I could find. And then when you know, half of the percentage each year is of course more. Then last time I mentioned, it was the same report I found on page 11 where they talked about, in the previous fiscal year, we'd spent almost 300,000, I think, on what they said was like charter transfers to the charter deficits. And at the meeting I was at, we talked about all the tax we'll have to pay, all the interest we'll have to pay if we have to borrow money from the state. And if the charters are borrowing money from us, it seems like they should have a repercussion. And so I'd be really interested in a lot more detail on the past 10 years, how much money, it seems to be adding up to millions of dollars going to the charter schools, and when we're talking about having to lay off counselors and things like that and all the budget cuts. I'd be really curious on the exact details on over 10 years, how much money did we lose these past 10 years on the charters, and are the charter schools getting more money per student than the regular schools based on these deficits that they're getting? I mean, I would love to understand that and before we make more teacher cuts and major things. And then all the discussion today, my last comment, I'm lucky enough to have CalPERS health benefits and things like that, and they're way cheaper than what you guys are talking about, this health net thing. You don't have to answer this as rhetorical. I don't know if you have the answer, but it seems like with the state, all departments, hundreds of thousands of people are under CalPERS, and all the teachers are under CalSTRS. And so I'm wondering why we don't go, like, instead of just the district, why aren't all the teachers in the state, all teachers in Northern California, you know, much, much bigger in this economies of scale of that negotiation? Thank you very much for all your time. Appreciate it.
And you have a lot of good points that I probably could address right now if you remind me of each one, and I don't know if you want me to entertain that or we can provide it in response following. in follow-up to this meeting.
I think what we can do is, just because of the number of points and very good points, maybe we can just hang out for a few minutes after.
And I certainly do our best to address them because I have answers for you. And anyone else who wants to stay. And, Nathaniel?
We've talked a lot about the healthcare, but the other outlier being the special ed. What's the reason behind that we're spending more than other?
So we get funded from the state, and it's funded as a district as a whole based on the number of students we have, not based on our number of identified students with special needs. So I believe that we've had several studies over our special education department. Next board meeting, they're coming forward with their special education local plan area report on costs, and we don't have enough capacity to serve the student needs, so that means we have to outsource and contract with non-public schools and non-public agencies to serve our student needs. So we're definitely looking at all ways we can be more efficient in our delivery model, but in some classifications of employees, we're unable to hire to meet the need of those students we serve. And so there's an inherent cost into outsourcing in providing that need for our students. So we are definitely evaluating that and how to best address that so we can still serve student needs and have a better return on investment in the cost.
I just wanted to also add to that, our percentage for students identified for special, needs is 14%. And on the statewide average is 11. So we're above the statewide average in terms of how many students we've identified for special need. But we also are an outlier in how much we're spending on our non-public school expenditures. So that's something that staff will look at. But just in terms of addressing the federal and the state underfunding special needs services or special education, the governor is proposing, and both the Assembly and the Senate are supporting a $700 million in ongoing increase. So that is going to provide some additional revenue to all districts. We just don't know by how much because they're still working out the details on how those dollars would go out. But there is some relief coming. Not as much as is necessary, though.
So is that an implication that we're over-identifying kids as special needs in this district? And maybe that's being looked into, or?
That is certainly being looked into because we are above the state average. So to the extent that we are spending more dollars on special ed, it's dictated by how many students we have identified.
Mm-hmm.
So that can come down a bit, but overall, all districts are experiencing general fund pressure because those special education dollars are increasing.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just say, to be fair, other districts, not placing blame, they could be under-identifying as well.
Do we get more money if we have more students, or is it just a flat rate that the state pays to every district? For this is your special ed money, use it as you see fit, you get $100, you get $100, or do we get it based on the percentages?
We have, go ahead. We have multiple funding sources, like I shared. There's federal and there's state, but our state dollars, they come through our county office of education. They're referred to as AB 602 funding, and it's defined in there a pretty specified amount, and it's allocated based on our overall district population, not based on our student need in special ed. So that's where Member Garcia referred to the legislature and the governor looking at other ways to change the funding model. That's been a topic of discussion over the last several years, how to better fund our special education program in the entire state.
And there's a lot of inequity in that funding model because the AB 602 funding model it dates back to the 1980s, I believe, so they're updating that. So, and Sacramento would benefit from that because we're on the lower end of the reimbursement scale.
I have a question about your statement of the third-party contracts. because my thought process was that's more cost neutral, because we don't have the employees to provide the services. We have to contract with non-public services to provide those. But if we were to hire those personnel, then we have salary and pension costs and all the other total compensation. Don't they kind of cancel each other out?
It depends on the provider and the number of students that we're serving. It's an economies of scale issue if you have a staff person that specializes in a certain area that can serve our student need, as opposed to having to provide, look for a vendor, and having a limited number of vendors to choose from is similar to some of the healthcare. I mean, we're negotiating rates, but if you have a limited number of people to choose from, certainly it would be a better efficiency to have people in-house.
Can you address I don't exactly know how to describe it, but the mistake, the error in the ADA, and how that has impacted projections and all of that?
So I believe it was on the budgetary side, and it didn't impact the actual costs, but there was a projection issue. And correct me if I'm getting this wrong, if I'm not understanding what you're referring to. We had misrepresented the number of ADA, and so the amount of revenue projected was inaccurate, but we have since corrected that, and that was just from on a budget. It didn't affect the funding that we anticipate. I probably have it backwards. Didn't affect the staffing, thank you. So we had already staffed based on the number of students. It was just an impact to the number of dollars we anticipated receiving for those students. So our expenditures, I'm following it now. Our expenditures were accurate based off the staffing. The revenue had an incorrect number.
This does go ahead. No, go ahead.
After that mistake was discovered, so that the projected revenue went up. Okay.
Correct, and that's what we included in the third interim. Between the second interim and the third interim is when we discovered that, and we included it in the third interim, which was adopted at the last board meeting or 2 board meetings ago. In part, back to the question I think somebody asked about the methodology that we utilized, or I think it was, about the FICMAT, around cohort survival. We're not doing projection enrollment very statistically strong. We were simply saying how many students ended the school year at our school, and that's how many students we have. So we decided to contract with a third party to implement a more robust process that looks at, a student who starts in kindergarten, how many of them will be in 5th grade in 4 years, and if they have a sibling, how many students will we have? We used the wrong report in the second interim, which had excluded some of our alternative schools, American Legion, Capital City, and others. We had already done all the staffing. We had already decided how many staff and all of that stuff we were going to need. So it was in the resources that we would have access to, which is now reflected in the third interim. But it was an error that was made by our staff, which we corrected when we discovered it.
Is there a dollar amount connected to that?
Mm-hmm.
I don't recall the number.
I think it was $7 million for this year. And again, it's through that process that we have more confidence that we will continue to lose students, and we have to keep that in mind as we project in future years. It's not just a Sac City issue, it's happening across the entire state, but it's also why we need to do some of the branding that you spoke of, sir. How do we make sure that we continue to promote the wonderful opportunities available to us? I mean, I know that in the Rosemont area we have, some Waldorf schools that that are highly sought after. We have a high school that is a Waldorf-based high school, and I was reminded the other day in a meeting that Sac City, outside of our area, is highly regarded and respected for having such robust Waldorf-based programs. For example, we have very small high school specialty programs, in health and engineering. So we have really wonderful opportunities in Sac City, and we need to make sure that we're marketing ourselves so that people come back to our school sites based on their perceptions from years ago.
Hi, my name is Scott Graves. My daughter attends Alice Burney. Somehow I managed to sit through 2 hours without asking a single question. So I sort of have reserved maybe 30 seconds to a minute to let everybody know that next Monday, June 3rd, at Oak Ridge Elementary in Oak Park, a parent advocacy and education organization called Parents United to Restore Our Schools, which got off the ground just a few weeks ago, is going to be holding our 4th meeting. Our first meeting was a month ago at Washington Elementary in Midtown. We had about 20 people in attendance. A couple weeks ago, we had our 3rd meeting, and we had 150 people in attendance and 3 local news organizations. So we're growing. We're providing an independent voice, a way for parents to inject their thoughts and their ideas into this process to prevent our district from essentially going down the drain, which is where a state takeover would take us. And that's still on the horizon, although some are arguing that there's nothing to worry about now. We are not anywhere near out of the woods, and we need to get serious about this. So the goals of our organization, twofold. We want to create the best possible educational experience for all kids in Sacramento, and we want a fiscally sound foundation on which to build our future. We have not had that for years, and we are not headed in the right direction. We think parents' voices, along with the good work of our board and our superintendent and our labor partners in this district, if everyone can get on board, we can get to the future that we all want. So our 4th meeting, again, next Monday, 6 p.m., Oak Ridge Elementary, in Oak Park, and we're planning on sticking around. So if you'd like to help out, attend the meeting, please see me, and I have flyers here, and I can get you hooked up with that. Thank you.
There's also a Facebook page. You can join, and there's a lot of parents that provide a lot of good information.
So there's also a Facebook page.
I just want to say that I think it's very nice that we have Waldorf and we have all these other charter schools, but I think in rebranding and saying how wonderful we are, that we need to go back to the basic public school because they are tremendous. I work at 2 of them, and they have wonderful qualities, and I know of teachers at Rosemont who could get jobs and earn more money at other schools, but they are so proud of where they work, of their school, and so invested in our school district that's what needs to be brought to the forefront. It's not just our charter schools. It is the public school that we have for everyone that is accessible to more children.
And to expound on that, our Waldorf Methods program at the elementary level is a traditional public school. It is not a charter school.
I have a question because you had mentioned about contracting out for getting better statistical information on projected enrollment. So because we're now in the process of hiring a new CBO, Chief Business Officer, because the other ones, whatever, have been released, would that not be part of their knowledge base? So when they're dealing with the budget, that they would have that expertise to do that, and then you don't have to contract out?
A great question, Ms. Delagua. There's a number of other skill sets that we're going to be looking for, and while I will do everything I can to bring somebody that has all of those skill sets, for example, you heard some of the issues related to OPEB and retiree health care. I mean, that requires also a great deal of experience and skill set as well. I mean, this is just a very multifaceted, complex set of skills that we're going to require. So we will strive to have somebody that has those skill sets. But in some cases, I think it will also serve us well to have a third-party, neutral, independent analysis of some of the things, because I have experienced and do also recognize and appreciate and am sensitive to the level of mistrust that exists today, and as I understand has existed for many years between our district and some of our labor partners. So I do think that in some cases, as this gentleman reminds me, I think it is important to sometimes say, this is a Department of Education website where you can find the information. That analysis was conducted by this independent entity as well, until we are in the place that I think we all strive for, which is where we can trust one another, or at least agree on the information that we're going to put out, because there is agreement on the information that we're putting out to our community. So.
Move forward.
In the interest of time, the original plan presentation and what we shared before, we've gone into great detail on these line items. Do you want me to continue? Okay. I do want to expound on what the superintendent had shared with respect to the reserve and the 2% versus the 4%. We are required in education code to maintain a certain reserve level based on the size of our district. So for a district our size, and it's actually from 30,000 students to I think 400,000 students, 2% is the figure. Now for 4% for our district, 4% is about half a month's payroll for us. And as we said before, that's not sufficient enough to get by. And the proposed language on the State Department of Ed's website with respect to a reserve policy reiterates what our Government Finance Officers Association says, which is roughly 2 months of your operating expenditures, and that equals about 17%. On average, and I think it was data, 17-18 data, on average, a unified school district may, across the state, has had a 17%, but for districts our size, it's roughly 10%. And still, that wouldn't even get you through 2 months of operations. And so there's legislation out there that says if certain things happen at the state level, there is a proposed cap on the amount of the reserve that a school district could maintain, and that would be double our required minimum. So for our district, that actually equals 4%, although best practice does say 17% is more prudent to get you through uncertain economic times. So just in summary, the amount of cuts on the previous slide on the recommended plan is $34 million. Again, that's to buy us time to make the negotiated agreements with our labor partners, to eliminate our deficit spending, and to build up our reserve to 4%. That's additional cuts? Additional savings ongoing, and since I didn't have as much opportunity to go through the detail on this previous slide, the numbers will show how that impacts. It has a compounding effect. So if we make $29 million in cuts in 2 years, that is another $29 million in the following year. But that's what would be needed to achieve those 3 goals that I had outlined.
So if you're, So if you're looking at the staff recommended plan, it's the third line from the bottom that shows required ongoing reductions. And in 2021, that's 29 million, and then in the next year it's an additional 5 million. So that's where you get the 34. But I do want to kind of step back for a second from those specific numbers, because I want us all to recognize that these are projections. These are based on the best information we have at this time, right? We talked about the governor's and the legislative proposals on special ed funding, for instance. Those things haven't been finalized. When they are, those will likely be reflected into the, to the either the adopted budget or to the 45-day later reconciliation of the budget, and those numbers will fluctuate and change. So I just want everybody to be cognizant that, if you want to follow the numbers sort of week by week or update by update, you can do that, but you have to pay a lot of attention to realize like exactly what's what. I think the big picture things that I would look at, as a community member, as a parent, are what is our level of deficit spending? I think that's an important thing. Are we spending $20 million more than we're taking in a year, right? That's something we need to be concerned about, because that shows that the level of spending is not sustainable according to the revenues we have. So I think this provides a good plan for where we are now, but I don't want, it provides specific numbers for where we are now. I'm going to reserve comment on whether it's a good plan, because I have significant reservations about doing nothing and waiting a year to realize a massive amount of savings. But we'll talk in more detail about that in the next upcoming board meetings. But I don't want to get hung up on the specific numbers, but we need to look at kind of the overall target and the scale, so we know it's around 30 million within 2 years that we need to come up with.
I think for me, so I've gone to several of these. I watched it online at Hiram Johnson and then went to Cal in Burbank. And I think what stands out to me is Ms. Canfield, from the consultant, had said that you guys have gone through pretty much everything you can, and you can start nickel and diming and picking, and at most you might be able to find another 2 to 5 million. So to me, that really just still bothers me, because even if you cut 5 from 29, we're still 24. And I just hope, and I know that the rest is going to have to be done through negotiations. I'm trying to be optimistic. I just hope that we're thinking of a plan B if it doesn't, because the alternative is going to be horrendous if we go to a state takeover.
Absolutely, I would agree, and we've been talking about that for the last couple months, and I'd appreciate actually community feedback on how do you think we should approach this? Should we make a deeper level of cuts in 1920 that don't have to be negotiated? And those cuts will hurt. Those will affect students and families. There's no way around it.
Yeah, and so there's a couple of things that I keep thinking about. There's the obvious about where this money will come from, and I think whatever was intended or not intended. Hey, the contract ends June 30th. There needs to be a new contract, and there has to be some serious talk about where some of these savings can be. But the biggest concern I have, because just hearing about we need to be able to talk about the programs that we have and all of these different things. I mean, the last meeting that went till like almost 1 in the morning, I was watching at home, and there was something that the superintendent said at about 12:40, which was, you came here, and what the call was from Sac City was that we need to change our district. I mean, we have been in the news for suspension rates that here we are in another year, and I will tell you that those rates probably have not changed. Another year of black students being suspended at high rates, losing hours of instruction time. Another year where English learners, again, we're not the greatest district for English learners. Another year has gone by. And so one of the things that you said is that by year 6, if your contract's there, right, that's when we're looking. I mean, we have needs now. Forget about highlighting, whatever it is that people want to highlight. Yeah, in some schools you can highlight everything. And there's so many people. And I talk from a perspective that I know that my daughter's going to get whatever she needs, and if I need to, we're going to do whatever it takes for her to get an education. But for so many of the kids in this district, a high percentage of the kids in this district, they're stuck here. They're stuck. And I don't want a nickel and dime to get to 34 million. I want to have created huge change so that we can actually serve all of these kids. That we could actually serve. It doesn't matter who they are, but they have access to GATE, to all these things, because who cares if they're identified if you don't have a program for them? I mean, so I'm just concerned about getting to 34 million and still having the same quality, that where we can highlight some things in some neighborhoods, but there's some things that we can't highlight in some of the schools that we have in this district, and that's where I really need I really want to see how we move this, because it's not just about getting to those cuts. It's about how we're going to change the way things are done in this district, because again, nothing's changing. These kids are still being suspended. These kids are still not receiving the education that they need, and it's in the school district that we know that we're at that level, and we're trying hard to cut $34 million to remain at that level, and that's unacceptable.
As we start to end here, I do want to just clarify that the idea of having a 2% reserve 2 years out so that our budget would be approved would mean that we wouldn't have any resources other than getting our budget approved, which we would celebrate. We wouldn't have any resources to invest in student programs, and that's the point that I was making. So you'd have to go 2 years out before you say, well, can we get to 3% or can we get to 4% reserve? Because that, in essence, is what you would utilize to invest in youth, but you still don't want to just have a 2% reserve, which is why it's important that as a community we come together and say, we must have a reserve in times like these above X percent. We hit that percentage, and then anything above that is how we invest in our youth. So when you look at a multi-year like this one, the one we submitted to SCOE does not show 2%. The one we submit once we adopt the budget may or may not still. My point was that you're looking 2 years beyond today before you can even think of having resources to invest in youth. And yes, at 1240, that was the point that I was making, that 2 years from now is when my contract ends, for example. And so that would mean 4 years of not having resources, but also for our board members, right? It would mean going through a term perhaps. For our 9th graders, it'll mean going through their entire high school experience without us being able to invest in student programs. I mean, you can use any example of it, but that can't be lost on our community, that the idea of 2 years out and only having a 2% and having a budget approved means that we can't fall below 2%, which means we don't have any resources to invest because our budget's going to be disapproved.
Superintendent, can I just say to the community, if you weren't at the last board meeting or didn't have an opportunity to watch it, I highly recommend that you go back and watch the section on the 3rd interim budget report. There is a list that the board was presented of student support services or student programs and the price tag that's connected to those. And these are the programs that, that don't have to be negotiated. And we know by looking at this, the money's going to have to come from somewhere, right? We know what that line looks like, and so you know, just to name a few that are on this list that would be detrimental to our district. And I appreciate Member Moralski talking about these, you know, deep cuts directly to our students. You know, the parent participation preschool. We have Miss Anita sitting in our audience who is, you know, our highly sought after parent participation preschool teacher. The credit recovery program that's so important to our students to have them graduate. That's you know, $1.4 million. Social emotional learning to our district, $890,000. District-wide athletics, $2.1. Could you imagine if we took away these programs? At our high school, we've talked a lot about the career technical education program that we have new there. That's, you know, we started with, we anticipated only having 60 students. I think we're up to like 223 at this point, and we've added an advanced program because it's so sought after. That's $2.9 million. These are the kind of things that we need to be looking at as a community, all of us together. So I highly recommend just going onto the website and just watching the presentation on it's the 3rd interim budget report.
And just to follow up on that, there are different funding sources for these different programs, and so just to clarify that the only one that's funded through totally unrestricted funds is district-wide athletics, and that's $2.1 million. The other ones are funded either from partially unrestricted dollars or from supplemental concentration and grant funding. And so there may be questions about whether we can actually save dollars for some of the programs that are funded through supplemental and concentration, because there are, it's sort of a partially restricted set of dollars that we have. But that said, I think, you know, if a receiver or an administrator or trustee came in, there are ways to move that money around whereby some of those programs would be at risk, because there is flexibility for the supplemental and concentration dollars. So I don't want to, I just wanted to point out that there are different funding sources, and some of them may be more restricted than others. But I think it's fair to say that most or all of those programs that were mentioned could be at risk.
And I have it up here. I'm happy to stay afterwards to answer any questions or share my information with you.
Also to share, on our district website, there is a budget update page. So there's a lot of great information and resources there that we've presented through the course of this journey that we've been taking this last year, and I encourage you to check it out if you have access to our website.
I would also like to invite the community to come to the next Fiscal Transparency and Accountability Committee meeting. I mentioned we'd be meeting in July to talk about OPEB and something else, but our next meeting is June 13th at the district, and it will be at 6 p.m. Thursday, June 13th.
Are those posted somewhere?
Yes, on the committee, if you look under Board of Education, there's a link that says Board Committees, and it'll take you to all the board committees. The agendas will be posted 72 hours prior, and anyway, we'll have an agenda up there. I'm sure it will be very interesting and timely and relevant, and I'd love to have as much participation from the community, because, you know, honestly, the more eyes on what we're doing and the more transparency we have, the better our decisions will be.
I gotta say, it seems like you guys are pointing the finger at the district, at the programs, at the teachers, at anybody that's not in CERNA. And if you live and reside in CERNA Center, your job is protected, your salary is protected, and I saw a chart that may or may not be correct, but most of the people that are working at CERNA Center are making more than the governor of the state of California. And there's something wrong in that picture. Something dramatically and desperately wrong in that picture. When our district is struggling to survive and we're paying that kind of money for salaries for a little bitty district. We're not Los Angeles, we're not Fresno. We're a little bitty district, a good size, decent size. There's something wrong. And I challenge you to be Lee Iacocca and take a dramatic pay cut to get us through this, and maybe on the outside, on the other side, when we're done and we're in the black solidly and bold, you can get some of that money back. I challenge you to be Lee Iacocca.
Can I just ask a clarifying question to you, ma'am?
Sure.
The list that you saw, where did that list come from? And are you speaking of just the superintendent's pay structure?
I'm not talking of superintendents, and kudos to you. I saw a chart, or I looked it up on the website and found out that we are the third largest district of the 6th in the Sacramento area, and that you are getting paid the 4th highest pay. So kudos. But you're still making way more than the governor of the state of California, and there's something wrong.
Well, I think that's a systematic change for all of California.
They're not in receivership threat.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but the board did do their due diligence to find a superintendent that would stay for the long haul to pull us out of the issues that we're having.
really quickly. I just want to address that because I've been an administrator and I've seen the total compensation of teachers when I've had to do my site budget, and there were probably half of my staff that made more than I did as the assistant principal at the school that I was at, and I'm talking total compensation. So this is salary and benefits. When I started in administration, I paid 100% of my benefits at $1,600 a month, and in admin, I actually made the exact same pay as I did as a teacher when I first started. I chose to come back into the classroom for many, many reasons, mainly because I missed the kids and I really wanted to teach them. But I actually make more in total compensation, or very close to what I made as a teacher, than when I did as an admin, because I have my salary, which is less, but my benefits are much better. Where admin, my pay was more, but I had to pay for those benefits. So I hear what you're saying and I get it. And I'm only an 11-year teacher veteran. I mean, if I were to, next year I'm gonna make $3,000 more, and with the raise I'll make $3,000 more plus whatever I make in my column upgrade every year. That administrators don't have that. They max out at a certain column. Teachers max out at whatever, 25, 30, I'm not 100%. So starting like next year and the years before, I'm gonna make more as a teacher than I would going back to admin. So I hear what you're saying, and I do know that that's put out there a lot, but I'm just, do your due diligence in researching that. I'm sure there are new teachers that make much less because they're new and they're gonna make very minimal. But when you get up, and become like 8, 9, 10 and above, it really kind of averages out admin and teacher. Plus, I just wanna say, they also work an extra month. They also are contracted for an extra 2 hours, which is another reason why I left the administration, because I had to work a 12-month work year. And so that 2 extra months of compensation, also made a difference. And the extra 2 hours a day, which was 40 hours a month, made a big difference in compensation. So I hear what you're saying, but it might not be accurate in all scenarios.
And if I could address that, I think that the number I see here, I was just looking it up, the governor makes $190,000, and I know the district has posted the salaries of all the general fund administrators. So this is just a portion of them, but these are the administrators that are paid through the unrestricted general fund, which is our kind of flexible spending. And that pays for most of the core kind of administrative functions that aren't like grant funded. And there's two out of 2 pages, I can't tell how many there are on this sheet, but maybe 50 or so. There's 2 that are above $190,000. Above the salary of the governor, the superintendent, and the deputy superintendent, and the rest are below.
And another point to make, even to eliminate all of that administration, it wouldn't even put a dent in what we need to achieve. We have less than 4% that are considered in that administrative group out of the total funded positions in the unrestricted general fund. It represents less than 4%.
But on the chart that you're talking about, that had all of the different programs, and that you said only one of them was general fund funded. Mm-hmm. So the chart that you're talking about, and only one of them is general fund funded, you're talking about nickel and diming that. And I'm talking about everybody pitching in all of their nickels and dimes and starting from the top down.
And I think in Member Pritchett's point, and correct me if I'm wrong, in sharing this chart, the board hasn't taken any action in making any reductions to any of this information that they're sharing on program costs. It was to evidence these are the types of programs that are funded out of unrestricted general fund and what those programs cost and the types of hard decisions that could be presented to us. But because of the restrictions we have in certain funding sources, there's really not much that we can even do in those areas as well. So if I misrepresented that, correct me. But
I think you're right. My point was that I want the community to be aware of the types of things that are being presented to the board at the board meetings.
Mm-hmm. And I would also just follow up on that and say I don't think anything is off the table in terms of administrative salaries, administrative positions. I mean, we're looking at everything.
I don't know if I can be real articulate on this. First and foremost, I appreciate the town hall meetings. I'm not a parent. I don't have any axe to grind other than being a taxpayer and someone who very much cares about the community. One of the things that happens is we think about everything in terms of money. And the gentleman who was left talked about student enrichment. And not all student enrichments have to cost money. And he talked about suspensions of children of color or children in lower income schools. And I was thinking about, I spent a lot of time thinking about this. Kids make mistakes. Kids who are 6, 7, and 8 make mistakes. And they get suspended and they get in trouble. Adults make mistakes too. Sac City School District, Unified School District, has made lots of mistakes for about 15 years, if not longer. You guys, and I don't want anyone to lose their job, I'm not saying that at all, but other than taking some political hits, everybody is gonna probably come out unscathed, but the little kids still get suspended. And maybe somehow this can work into the curriculum, that young people make mistakes and they survive. School districts make mistakes and school districts survives. I don't know exactly how I'm collating, but somewhere in my very tired mind, there's a lesson to be learned that can be taught to the kids. You've made a bad decision, but you're not a bad person. The adults who are in charge of your school made some poor decisions. Life goes on, you'll be okay. You're only 6 or 7 or 8, the world doesn't come to an end. Someone much brighter than me is gonna have to make that connection. But somewhere in here, there's a life lesson for our students.
Just really quick, since we're talking about pay, right? I mean, again, I don't begrudge the superintendent and the teachers making 6-figure salary. Well, first of all, I was surprised because we keep hearing, again, the conventional wisdom, oh, you're gonna be a teacher. Well, good on ya. But then, there are websites out there that actually talks about, again, I'm a state employee, so my pay is out there. I don't think it should be, but it is, because I'm paid by a taxpayer. And all of the teachers and all of your pays are out there in transparent California. I really didn't want to be out there. But again, we're not saying that the pays are not adequate. I think I just want to make sure that we say that. And I think Member Garcia, I think you're or Member Pritchett, one of you said that, yeah, we could cut the administrator pay to, I don't know, let's say 120. I don't think you need it. Who's going to take that job? Again, I understand what you're saying about the whole you know what, but these are private companies. They say, you know what, I'm doing it because I know I get stock options. I would love to give this guy stock option and give him nothing, right? Like, I would love to give him some Facebook stock and say, you know what, you get 0 pay, but trust me, you'll get paid later. But we can't do that. So I think I just want to make sure that point comes across as saying, you know what, again, it is so easy to blame the administrator. Say, again, like I said, the Crystal, that brand new building that you built out there, it looks really gorgeous, the lights up. But again, that doesn't, like you said, it doesn't make a dent. So again, we could get rid of every single administrator there are, and I love our principals at Phoebe and Sutter, but that doesn't make a dent. So it's a math problem. It's kind of like what Governor Brown did, again, doing the PEPRA, doing the modifying. I mean, again, it's a math problem. It doesn't matter how many programs. We could get rid of all athletics. I'll be sad, but we could get rid of everything. It doesn't matter. There's not enough numbers in there. There's not enough zeros. So I just want to make that point. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we should kind of wrap up. I'm going to say we're looking for ways to boost our revenue and resources to support our education programs. We know that as parents, you do as much for our schools through fundraisers and volunteering, and for that we're very grateful. One while boosting our revenues won't eliminate the need for budget cuts, it can provide resources for students. And some of the things we're looking at are community partnerships, sponsorships, parcel taxes, grants, and selling unused property and equipment. So if you have any ideas, you can share your ways to boost our revenue. Please write your ideas on cards so we can consider your thoughts. If you can help us with your revenue boosting ideas, please include your contact information. It's incumbent on us to all work together towards a solution to ensure that the district has financially stable future for the benefit of our students today and tomorrow. Please remember that we have white index cards near the back for you to write down any follow-up questions that you have. Your questions will be submitted on your cards and will appear on the district's board meeting webpage under today's meeting in the near future. Thank you very much for attending.